Dark secrets exposed. The storage room is haunted. Summary. After months of job hunting, Peter accepts a lucrative but ominous warehouse manager position at a remote facility built over an old cemetery. Despite eerie rumors of hauntings and workers abandoning their posts, Peter dismisses the stories as superstition. On his first overnight shift, strange occurrences begin. Faint footsteps echo in the dark, chilling whispers call out to him, and a ghostly boy with bruised wrists appears. The deeper Peter ventures into the shadows, the more he realizes the warehouse is alive with restless spirits. Outside, dozens of eerie figures gather, their glowing eyes fixed on him, warning him to leave. But escape may no longer be an option. The oppressive darkness tightens its grip as Peter learns the horrifying truth: those who enter may never return. By morning, Peter is gone, leaving only a flickering flashlight and footprints that vanish into the void. The warehouse stands silent once more, awaiting its next victim. Part 1. The job offer. Peter sat slumped at his kitchen table, a chipped coffee mug in one hand and a stack of rejection letters in the other. The walls of his tiny apartment seemed to close in on him with every passing day. Bills lay unopened in a pile, the red-inked warnings glaring at him like accusations. He rubbed his temples, trying to ignore the pit in his stomach, a mixture of hunger, stress, and helplessness. There's got to be something, he muttered, clicking aimlessly through job boards on his old laptop. The screen flickered, almost mocking him with the same postings he'd already applied to twice over. Then, the phone rang. The sudden sound jolted Peter upright. He hadn't received a call in days, maybe weeks. "Hello," he croaked, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. Peter Dawson, the voice on the other end, was gruff, businesslike. "Yeah, this is him. This is Warren Mills. Timber Company, I've got your application here. You managed warehouses before." Peter straightened up, his pulse quickening. "Yes, sir. 5 years at the Coastal Seafood Depot. Managed everything: inventory, scheduling, deliveries." The works. Warren grunted approvingly. "Good. I need someone immediately. Warehouse manager position. Remote location. Pays good. $2,000 a month." Peter nearly dropped the phone. $2,000? That was double what he earned at his last job. The words settled into his mind like a lifeline. Still, it was too good to be true. "That's a generous salary, sir." "What's the catch?" There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then Warren spoke, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "The warehouse has history. It was built over an old cemetery. Rumors spread, workers quit, people get spooked. That's all nonsense, of course. But I need someone who won't listen to ghost stories, someone who can handle it. Think you can?" Peter blinked. A cemetery. Warren's tone remained level. "Graves were relocated before construction. Officially, it's just a warehouse. If you're not afraid of the dark, the job's yours. Start tomorrow. Lot 44, Route 17, 7 sharp." Peter hesitated, the word cemetery clawing at the edges of his mind. But then he glanced at the stack of bills, the empty fridge, the calendar filled with overdue reminders. "I'll take it," he said firmly. "Good. Don't be late," Warren replied and hung up. The drive to Lot 44 was longer than Peter expected. The highway gave way to narrow roads that twisted through forests, where gnarled branches clawed at the dull gray sky. The further he went, the fewer signs of life he saw. No houses, no stores, no people, just endless, brooding trees. Fog clung to the ground as he turned onto Route 17. A rusted sign reading Lot 44 barely stood upright, its paint peeling with age. Peter turned down the gravel path, his tires crunching loudly in the oppressive silence. Then he saw the warehouse. It was massive, a looming structure with weathered white walls streaked with grime. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were thick with dirt. Despite its size, it felt strangely lifeless, like a hollowed-out carcass. Peter swallowed, his unease growing. "Just a building," he muttered, shutting off the car engine. The air outside was frigid, colder than it should have been. As Peter approached, a heavy metal door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Warren Mills was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Peter Dawson," Warren called. "Yes, sir," Peter replied, extending his hand. Warren shook it firmly. "Follow me inside." The warehouse was eerily quiet. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into shadows. Rows of shelves towered like sentinels, their contents shrouded in tarps and darkness. The air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and something else Peter couldn't place, something metallic. "This is the main floor," Warren said briskly, his voice echoing. "We store lumber here, mostly. Some businesses rent space for equipment. Deliveries come in once or twice a week. You'll manage inventory, supervise workers when we get shipments. Simple enough." "Yeah, no problem," Peter replied, though he couldn't stop glancing at the dark corners of the warehouse, where shadows seemed to shift. Warren led him to a small office tucked into the far wall. The space was sparse: a dusty desk, an old computer, and a single light bulb dangling from the ceiling. "This is yours," Warren said. "Phone's here if you need me. I'll check in tomorrow. Any questions?" Peter hesitated. What exactly spooked the last guy? Warren's expression darkened slightly. "People hear things. Rats in the walls, the building settling. That sort of thing. Let your imagination run wild and it gets worse." "You're not like that, are you?" "No, sir," Peter said quickly, though he wasn't so sure. "Good." Warren clapped him on the shoulder. "Stick to your work, and you'll be fine with that." Warren turned and left, the sound of his boots fading into the vast emptiness of the warehouse. Peter sat down in the creaking chair, the office door clicking shut behind him. For a moment, he simply listened to the silence. It wasn't normal silence, there was a weight to it, like the building itself was holding its breath. "It's just a job," Peter whispered, gripping the desk edge. "Just a job," but as the dim light flickered overhead, a chill crept up his spine. From somewhere deep in the warehouse, so faint it could have been his imagination, Peter thought he heard it, a soft thud. Part 2. Warnings ignored. Peter pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders as the cold morning air swept through the lot. The warehouse loomed ahead like a forgotten giant, silent and immovable, as though daring him to step inside. He had slept poorly the night before, visions of vague shadows and faint whispers clinging to his dreams, though he'd brushed them off his nerves. The paycheck was too good to pass up, and ghost stories weren't about to scare him off. The heavy metal door groaned in protest as Peter pushed it open, its echo reverberating through the cavernous space. He winced. Even in daylight, the warehouse felt dim and hollow. The air carried a damp chill that made Peter shiver involuntarily. He glanced around, trying to ignore how vast the space seemed. Morning, a gruff voice called, startling Peter. He turned sharply to see an older man emerging from behind a set of shelves. The man was wiry and bent with age, his gray coveralls smeared with oil and dust. He carried a rusted mop, its strands dripping slightly onto the concrete floor. "Didn't hear you come in," the man said, his voice rough but laced with a hint of humor. He leaned on the mop handle, scrutinizing Peter with sharp, pale blue eyes. "You must be the new guy," the man continued before Peter could respond. "I'm Tom. Been here longer than the rats. You're the manager, right?" Peter relaxed slightly, extending his hand. "Yeah, Peter Dawson. Nice to meet you, Tom." Tom gave his hand a firm shake, though his skin felt dry and cold. The old man straightened slightly, squinting up at the warehouse ceiling as though searching for something. "First time managing a place like this?" Tom asked, his voice dropping a little. "I've run warehouses before," Peter replied confidently. "It's just inventory and organization, right? Can't be much different from my last job," Tom snorted, shaking his head. "That's what they all say." "What do you mean?" Peter asked, curious despite himself. Tom's grin faded, his expression turning serious. He glanced around the warehouse as though ensuring they were alone. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "This place isn't like the others. You've heard what it's built on, haven't you?" Peter felt a prickle at the back of his neck. "Yeah, I heard. An old cemetery. Warren told me the graves were moved." Tom's lips pressed into a thin line, his pale eyes never leaving Peter's. "Moved? Hey, maybe the headstones were, but the ground." "The ground remembers," Peter chuckled awkwardly, trying to lighten the mood. "Simon, Tom. You don't believe in that stuff, do you? Ghost stories are for campfires. It's just an old warehouse. Tom didn't smile. Tell that to the last guy who worked here. Peter frowned. What happened to him? Tom shrugged, his gaze shifting. Quit after 2 nights. Said he heard voices. Saw things that weren't there. Thought he was losing his mind. You're not like that, are you? No, Peter replied quickly, though his confidence wavered under Tom's piercing stare. I don't scare easy, Tom sighed, gripping the mop handle tightly. You'll see. Just don't stay too late at night, and don't go poking around where you don't belong. Before Peter could respond, Tom shuffled off toward the back of the warehouse, his footsteps oddly muted against the concrete floor. The old janitor's words lingered in Peter's mind, like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. For most of the morning, Peter kept busy familiarizing himself with the layout of the warehouse. He checked the inventory log, organized a few shelves, and made notes about some damaged boxes. The work was straightforward, but every now and then, Peter would glance up and swear he saw something move in the corner of his eye, a flicker of shadow, a faint shape. Each time, he would turn his head sharply, only to find empty aisles and silent shelves. It's just my imagination, he told himself repeatedly. Tom got into my head. That's all. By noon, Peter realized he hadn't seen Tom in hours. He shrugged it off and decided to grab lunch. He made his way to the small office where he'd stashed his sandwich. Just as he was about to sit down, a faint clatter echoed from somewhere deep in the warehouse. Peter paused, chewing slowly, his ears straining. Silence. Then it came again, a distant metallic scrape, like something heavy dragging across the floor. Frowning, Peter stood up. Tom, he called. His voice bounced off the walls, but there was no answer. Grabbing a flashlight from the office, Peter ventured into the dim aisles. The sound grew louder as he walked, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. Tom, if you're messing with me, it's not funny, Peter muttered, his voice more annoyed than afraid. The noise stopped abruptly. Peter froze, his heart pounding. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. Slowly, he turned the flashlight toward the far end of the aisle. The beam landed on an old wooden crate, tipped slightly to one side. Peter exhaled sharply. Just a box. Nothing weird about that. He walked closer to set it upright, but as he bent down, he noticed something strange. The floor beneath the box, a layer of dust disturbed in long, deliberate streaks, almost as though the crate had been dragged across the floor. A chill crept over him. Tom, he called again, louder this time. Still no answer. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. The beam dimmed, then sputtered out entirely. Damn it, Peter cursed, shaking it. He stood still for a moment, surrounded by darkness so complete it felt as though the warehouse had swallowed him whole. Then, from somewhere nearby, he heard it, a whisper. Low, faint, and indecipherable. It seemed to echo off the walls, growing louder as though circling him. Peter's breath caught in his throat. His pulse roared in his ears. Hello, he managed, his voice shaking. The whisper stopped. The silence returned, heavy and unnatural. For a long moment, Peter stood frozen, afraid to move. Then the flashlight flickered back to life, its weak beam cutting through the dark. Peter turned on his heel and hurried back to the office, his boots thudding heavily against the concrete. He slammed the door behind him, breathing hard as he sank into the rickety chair. It's just an old building, he whispered to himself. Old buildings make noises outside. The warehouse remained silent. But Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching him. Part 3. The first night. The sky had darkened to an endless stretch of black by the time Peter stepped out of the small office and into the main warehouse floor. The building seemed larger now, more menacing, as if the shadows had grown thicker, heavier. He checked his watch, 11:15 p.m. The late-night shift was not something he had anticipated on his first day, but a delayed delivery meant he had no choice. Warren had been firm about it over the phone. You're the manager now. Make sure the shipment gets sorted when it arrives. Shouldn't take too long, Warren had said, his voice curt as always. Peter didn't argue he needed this job. Still, standing there alone, the silence gnawed at him. There were no humming machines or buzzing lights to break the quiet. Only the soft crackle of his footsteps on the cold concrete and the faint sigh of the wind outside. It's just a job, he told himself for the 100th time. There's nothing here but dust and wood. But even as he reassured himself, his mind kept circling back to Tom's warning. The ground remembers it was the kind of phrase that lingered, sticking to the corners of his thoughts no matter how much he tried to brush it off. Peter grabbed the flashlight from his desk, its beam slicing weakly through the dense gloom. The warehouse stretched endlessly in front of him, rows of wooden pallets and shelves forming a maze of silent, hulking shapes. It was colder now, unnaturally so, and the chill seemed to rise from the floor itself, seeping through the soles of his boots. A distant thud echoed from somewhere deep within the warehouse. Peter stopped dead in his tracks. "Tom," he called out, his voice carrying far too easily, bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the void. He knew Tom had left hours ago. Peter had watched him shuffle out through the main door, but the thought of anyone else being in here twisted his stomach. Silence. He swallowed hard, shining the flashlight across the aisles. "Hello? If someone's there, you're not supposed to be in here," Peter called again, his voice firmer this time. Still, no answer. The thud came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping noise. It sounded as if something heavy was being dragged across the concrete floor. Peter's heart skipped. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, forcing his legs to move forward. It's just a box, he thought. Something fell over. That's all, but the sound didn't stop. The dragging continued, rhythmic and deliberate, punctuated by occasional dull bangs. The flashlight's beam wavered as his hands began to tremble. Peter turned a corner, the sound now closer. A long aisle stretched ahead of him, shadowy shapes towering on either side. At the far end, a wooden crate sat tipped over, as though it had been knocked from its place. Dust lingered in the air, disturbed by something unseen. He approached cautiously, the sound of his own breathing deafening in his ears. The flashlight caught movement, just a flicker, something darting behind the crates. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Silence fell, the dragging sound vanishing as though it had never been there. Peter stood frozen, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the aisle. Nothing moved, but the cold grew sharper, needling into his skin like tiny blades. It's just rats, he thought, though his gut told him otherwise. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. The beam dimmed, sputtering as if something were draining the power. Peter smacked it against his palm, his breath quickening. For a moment, the light died completely, plunging him into total darkness. "No, no, no," he muttered, shaking the flashlight frantically. When the beam flared back to life, Peter nearly dropped it. A figure stood at the far end of the aisle. It was small, motionless, and pale like a child. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if observing Peter, though its face was obscured by the shadows. Who are you?" Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, impossibly still. Then, as Peter took a shaky step backward, the flashlight flickered again. In that brief moment of darkness, the figure vanished. When the light returned, the aisle was empty. Peter's heart pounded painfully against his ribs. His mind raced. "I'm just seeing things," he muttered under his breath. "I'm tired." That's all, but as he turned to leave, the dragging sound began again, this time behind him. He spun around, the flashlight swinging wildly. The aisle was still empty, but the sound grew louder, closer. Then he heard it, a whisper. Soft, indecipherable words floated through the cold air, sending a shiver down his spine. Peter staggered backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The whispering surrounded him now, hissing from every direction. He covered his ears, his breath coming in panicked gasps. "Stop," he shouted, his voice breaking. The whispers stopped. Silence crashed down like a wave. Peter lowered his hands slowly, his chest heaving. He forced himself to walk back toward the office, refusing to look into the dark aisles on either side of him. The flashlight shook in his grip, but he kept moving, his boots echoing on the cold floor. The office door appeared like a beacon. Peter lunged for it, wrenching it open and slamming it shut behind him. He sank into the chair, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his phone. No service. He sat there in the dark office, the flashlight beam pointed at the door. The silence in the warehouse was suffocating, pressing against the thin walls of the office like a physical force. Peter stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Then, from just beyond the door, he heard it again. Thud. The sound was slow, deliberate. It came in pairs, like footsteps someone walking. Peter's breath hitched as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. A faint shadow appeared beneath the crack, thin, unmoving. He gripped the flashlight tightly, aiming it at the door like a weapon. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint sound of his own breathing. After what felt like hours, the shadow disappeared. The footsteps receded, growing softer until they faded completely. Peter sat there frozen, too afraid to move. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, but his body refused to listen. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to creep through the office window, Peter slumped back in his chair, exhausted and shaken. His first night in the warehouse had felt like a lifetime, and in that moment he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone here. Part 4. The Pale Boy. The next evening, Peter arrived at the warehouse earlier than he wanted to. The previous night's events lingered like an iron weight on his chest, but he convinced himself that exhaustion and nerves had caused him to imagine things that trick at the shadows, maybe even sleep deprivation. He told himself this over and over again, like a mantra, but a quiet unease still stirred inside him. Stepping inside, Peter scanned the warehouse floor with an uneasy glance. Sunlight barely touched the cavernous room, disappearing into the heights of the ceiling, which seemed darker than it should be. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and forced himself to move, determined to stick to his responsibilities. Warren expects me to do my job, he thought. Tom's superstitions aren't my problem. By midnight, the warehouse had become the same stifling void it had been the night before. Peter sat in the small office with only the dim light of his desk lamp keeping the shadows at bay. He tapped his pen against the clipboard, scanning through inventory logs when he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Peter froze. It was faint but deliberate, like small footsteps against the concrete. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The sound came from outside the office door, somewhere near the shelves. Tom, Peter called weakly, even though he knew the janitor had gone home hours ago. The only answer was the tapping, growing fainter as though it were moving deeper into the warehouse. Peter exhaled sharply and grabbed his flashlight. Not again, he thought as he swung the door open and stepped onto the warehouse floor. The flashlight beam sliced through the thick darkness, illuminating dust swirling in the air. Peter followed the faint tapping sound, his boots clapping noisily against the concrete. The silence between each of his steps felt suffocating, punctuated only by the distant echoes of his movement. Then he saw it. At the far end of an aisle, just beyond the reach of his flashlight, a small figure stood still, a child-sized silhouette, pale and unmoving. Peter stopped cold. Who's there? The figure didn't move. The flashlight beam flickered as Peter aimed it at the shape. The boy stood no more than 15 feet away, small and fragile. His skin was deathly pale, so much so that it seemed to absorb the light. He wore a torn shirt and tattered pants, clothes that looked decades old. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his wrists. Peter's breath hitched as he noticed the boy's wrists. They were covered in dark bruises, as though they'd been bound tightly, and thin scratches marked the pale skin. "Kid, what are you doing here?" Peter's voice wavered as he took a cautious step forward. "Are you hurt?" The boy tilted his head just slightly. His expression remained blank, but his hollow eyes fixed on Peter. Then, without warning, the boy turned and darted into the shadows. "Hey," Peter shouted, breaking into a jog. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he chased after the boy, but no matter how fast he moved, he couldn't close the distance. The child's pale form flitted through the aisles like a shadow, always just out of reach. Peter turned a corner and stopped abruptly. The aisle stretched ahead of him, empty. He swung the flashlight around, its beam illuminating the shelves, the crates, the dark corners. There was no sign of the boy. The silence pressed against Peter's ears like a weight, and his pulse thundered. He took a shaky breath and whispered to himself, "I'm imagining things." That's all. Then, from somewhere close by, he heard it. Whispering soft, incoherent murmurs floated through the air, wrapping around Peter like a cold mist. He turned sharply, the flashlight jerking toward the source of the sound. The whispering grew louder, coming from all directions at once. Peter's heart pounded as he backed up, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He tried to call out, but his voice died in his throat. The whispers coalesced into faint words not loud enough to understand, but distinct enough to chill him to the bone. Then, from the corner of his eye, Peter saw movement. He swung the flashlight just in time to catch the pale boy darting across the aisle. This time, Peter saw his face clearly. It was twisted in anguish, mouth open in a silent scream. His hollow eyes bore into Peter's soul. The boy disappeared behind a row of crates. Peter staggered backward, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He stumbled against a crate, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise echoed deafeningly through the warehouse, and for a moment, everything went silent again. You're not real," Peter stammered, his voice trembling. He spun around, shining the flashlight behind him, but there was nothing there, only shadows stretching toward him like outstretched hands. Then the temperature dropped. A cold so deep and sudden that it felt like ice in his lungs. The flashlight flickered again. No, Peter muttered, shaking the light frantically. The beam sputtered and went out completely, plunging him into total darkness. He froze, his breath ragged. From the silence came a sound that made his blood run cold: footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. Tap, 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 tap. Peter gripped the useless flashlight like a weapon, his back pressed against a crate. "Who's there?" he shouted, though his voice cracked with terror. The footsteps stopped. For a brief moment there was nothing. Then, directly in front of him, two pale hands appeared on the edge of a crate, fingers curling over the wood. Peter's scream caught in his throat as the boy's face rose into view, just inches away. His hollow eyes stared blankly, his mouth parting slowly as though he were trying to speak. Peter scrambled backward, crashing into another stack of boxes. The sound roared through the warehouse, but the boy remained still, watching him. Then, in a blink, he was gone. Peter scrambled to his feet, panting heavily, his body shaking with adrenaline. The flashlight flared back to life, its beam steady now, as if mocking him. He spun in a circle, shining the light in every direction. The warehouse was empty, but Peter knew better. He stumbled back to the office, slamming the door behind him. He collapsed into the chair, running his hands through his hair. The whispers had stopped. The boy was gone, but the feeling lingered, the sense that something was watching him, waiting. Peter sat there until dawn, unable to sleep, unable to think. The pale boy's hollow eyes haunted him every time he closed his own. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the grimy office window, Peter finally let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. But one thought remained, lodged in his mind like a splinter: the boy wasn't finished with him yet. Part 5. The Gathering. Peter didn't sleep that morning. Even as the pale light of dawn spilled into his apartment through dusty blinds, he sat hunched on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. The boy's hollow eyes lingered in his mind, his whispered breath still curling in Peter's ears. There was no explaining it, no logic he could cling to. And yet, as unsettling as it all was, something compelled Peter to go back. The pay. The pay is too good. He told himself this over and over, as though repeating it might make him forget the warehouse's oppressive cold, the whispers, the boy's bruised wrists, the shadows. That night, the drive back to the warehouse seemed longer. The road twisted through the dense woods like an endless loop, the fog rising thicker and darker than usual. Peter clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he gritted his teeth. His headlights carved tunnels of pale light into the mist, but the black silhouettes of trees loomed just beyond reach, silent and watchful. "It's just nerves," Peter whispered to himself, though his voice didn't convince him. "It's all in my head." The warehouse emerged from the gloom, its decaying walls and sagging roof outlined against the moonlit sky. It was no longer just a building to Peter, it was a thing, alive and waiting. Its vast emptiness seemed to breathe with a rhythm all its own, and as he stepped from the car, the cold air tightened around him like unseen hands. Peter clicked on his flashlight as he pushed open the heavy door, which groaned its displeasure before slamming shut behind him. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and Peter winced, the noise ringing in his ears. He lingered in the entryway for a moment, flashlight pointed ahead. The warehouse was still and silent, the kind of silence that swallowed every other sound. It was unnatural. No hum of distant machinery, no scurrying of rats, just the vast emptiness, heavy with a presence Peter couldn't define. Peter let out a shaky breath and headed toward the office. He told himself he wouldn't explore tonight, he would stay inside, work on paperwork, and wait for morning to come. By midnight, Peter sat at the office desk with his head in his hands. His flashlight lay nearby, its beam dimming as the battery weakened. The single bulb overhead flickered every few minutes, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Outside the small office window, darkness swallowed everything beyond the glass. Then he heard it. A sound. Faint at first, then clearer. Tap. 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 Peter froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound wasn't coming from inside the warehouse this time, it was outside. He turned his head slowly toward the window, his heart hammering in his chest. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. The fog outside was thick, swirling against the glass like smoke. But then, movement caught his eye. Figures. Peter's body stiffened. Dozens of dark shapes moved through the fog, emerging one by one into view. They didn't move like people, their silhouettes were jerky, unnatural, as though their limbs didn't bend the way they should. Some shuffled slowly, others glided silently across the gravel lot. His blood turned to ice when he saw their eyes. Small pinpricks of glowing red light burned through the fog. The eyes moved together, all focused in eerie unison toward the warehouse. Toward him. Peter stumbled back, knocking over the chair. His hand shot out to grab the flashlight, and its beam bounced wildly as he pointed it out the window. The figures didn't scatter. They didn't blink. They just stood there, motionless now, their eyes fixed on him. "What the hell is happening?" Peter whispered, his voice hoarse. One figure moved closer to the window. Its shape became clearer as it approached, and Peter's heart plummeted. The pale boy stood there, framed by the fog. His bruised wrists hung limp at his sides, and his hollow eyes burned red in the dark. Peter scrambled away from the window, his pulse roaring in his ears. "No, no, no, no," the whisper started again. At first it was faint, a murmur that seemed to seep through the walls. But then the sound grew louder, until it filled the office like a storm. Peter clamped his hands over his ears, his flashlight beam shaking as it bounced across the walls. The whispers came in dozens of voices, all hissing over one another in a language Peter couldn't understand. He heard his name. Peter, his head snapped up, eyes wide with terror. The whisper stopped. The office fell silent again, save for Peter's ragged breathing. Then the sound of tapping returned. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap. 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 It came from the window. Peter turned his head slowly. The pale boy's face was pressed against the glass, his red eyes blazing like embers. He didn't move. He didn't blink. Peter let out a strangled cry and staggered back, his flashlight dropping to the floor and rolling to a stop. The boy's head tilted, as though curious, and the tapping grew louder, faster. Tap, tap, tap. The bulb overhead flickered wildly, casting the room into chaos. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and writhing. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony that made Peter's skull feel like it might split in two. "Stop!" Peter screamed, grabbing the flashlight and turning toward the door. He wrenched it open and stumbled into the warehouse. The tapping stopped. The whispers vanished. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Peter panted, the beam of the flashlight trembling as he swept it across the floor. He turned to glance at the window. The figures were gone. The fog outside was still thick, but the glowing eyes had vanished. The lot beyond the warehouse was empty, as though nothing had been there at all. Peter fell to his knees, his body shaking. He wanted to run, to leave and never come back, but his legs refused to obey. The silence mocked him as he sat there, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. From somewhere deep in the warehouse came a sound. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A child's laugh. High-pitched and echoing. It rippled through the empty aisles, growing louder before fading away into the dark. Peter covered his ears and squeezed his eyes shut, but the sound wouldn't leave him. It echoed inside his skull, endless and cruel. And in the back of his mind, a single thought surfaced, cold and certain. "They're not gone." Peter opened his eyes and whispered into the dark, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" Part 6. The warning. The office felt like a tomb. Peter sat slumped in the corner, back pressed against the peeling wall. The flashlight clutched tightly in his shaking hands. The light's beam wavered across the small room, the bulb flickering like a heartbeat on the verge of stopping. Outside the window, the thick fog rolled in waves, obscuring the gravel lot. The memory of the glowing red eyes still burned in his mind. "It's not real," Peter whispered hoarsely to himself, his voice raw and brittle. "It's not real." It's tap. The sound froze him. A single, deliberate tap echoed against the office door. Peter's breath caught in his throat, and he stared at the door, as though it might spring open at any moment. For a long time, there was silence. Then, the knob turned. Peter gripped the flashlight tighter, his knuckles turning white. The knob rattled slightly, the sound sharp and metallic in the deathly quiet. A low creak followed as the door began to open, just an inch at first, then another. A sliver of darkness from the warehouse beyond spilled into the office like a black tide. "No," Peter whispered. The door swung wider, and there he was. The pale boy stood in the doorway. The child's frame was thin and frail, like a shadow given form. His skin was ashen, stretched tightly over his small bones. Those bruised wrists hung limp at his sides, as though the weight of them were too much to bear. His head tilted slightly, and his hollow eyes, two bottomless pits of darkness, locked onto Peter. For a moment, neither of them moved. The boy simply stood there, watching, unblinking. Then, in a voice as thin as air, he spoke. "Leave. Or stay forever." The words hung in the air, whispered yet deafening. Each syllable hit Peter like a physical blow, and he gasped, his chest tightening as though invisible fingers were closing around his throat. What he croaked, his voice barely audible. The boy took a single step forward. The floor didn't creak beneath his feet. There was no sound at all, except the faint hiss of Peter's breath. The boy repeated, slower this time, "Leave. Or stay forever." Peter scrambled to his feet, pressing his back against the far wall, as though he might melt into it. The flashlight shook violently in his hand, the beam faltering. "You're not real," Peter shouted, his voice cracking. "You're not." The boy's face contorted. The slightest shift of his mouth into something that wasn't a smile, it was too empty, too cruel. And then, the lights went out. The bulb overhead shattered with a deafening pop. Glass rained onto the floor, and Peter screamed as the room was plunged into suffocating darkness. The flashlight sputtered violently in his hand, the beam growing weak, flickering like a dying flame. "No, no, no," Peter cried, smacking the flashlight in a desperate attempt to keep it alive. From the doorway came the sound of footsteps, light, barely audible, but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. The beam of the flashlight suddenly steadied, cutting through the dark. Peter swung it toward the doorway. The boy was gone. The room was empty. Peter's breathing came in ragged, uneven gasps. He scanned the room, the beam bouncing wildly, searching for any sign of movement. The office felt colder now, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your body feel foreign. Then the whispers began. They came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Dozens of voices, all overlapping, all hissing in a language Peter couldn't understand. The sound built like a tidal wave, swelling and echoing through the room, until it was all he could hear. His mind screamed for it to stop, but the whispers grew louder and louder. And then, through the chaos, came one clear voice. "Leave." The word cut through the others like a knife, and Peter staggered back. His flashlight beam swung wildly across the room. His hands were slick with sweat, the metal casing slipping in his grip. "Who's there?" Peter shouted, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. Peter stood frozen, the only sound his own frantic heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, slowly he turned the flashlight toward the window. And there he was, the boy. He stood just outside the glass, staring in. His face was inches from the pane, his hollow eyes fixed on Peter. The fog swirled around him, obscuring his small frame, but his face burned in Peter's mind. The boy didn't move. He didn't blink. Then, impossibly, the boy lifted one pale hand and pressed it to the glass. A dark smear appeared where his fingers touched not fog, but something darker. Something red. Peter stumbled backward, the flashlight falling from his hands and clattering to the floor. He pressed himself against the far wall, his chest heaving, his vision blurring with panic. "Leave," the voice came again, faint but clear. Peter squeezed his eyes shut. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The cold had him in its grip. When he opened his eyes again, the boy was gone. The window was empty, save for the faint outline of a handprint smeared across the glass. The whispers returned, distant now, like a warning carried on the wind. Peter forced himself to move, stumbling toward the office door. He wrenched it open and staggered onto the warehouse floor, his breath fogging in the icy air. The flashlight lay forgotten in the dark, its beam flickering once before dying completely. Peter didn't stop. He ran through the aisles, his footsteps pounding against the concrete, the sound echoing like a drumbeat. The whispers followed him, chasing him through the dark, growing louder with every step. When Peter finally burst through the main doors and into the night, he collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. The fog was still there, thick and unmoving, but the whispers had stopped. For now. Peter looked back at the warehouse, its shadow looming over him like a giant watching him flee. And in the window of the office he saw it. The boy. He stood there, small and still, his bruised wrists hanging at his sides, his hollow eyes watching Peter with a look that was neither anger nor pity. It was a promise. Leave, or stay forever. Part 7. Descent into terror. The gravel crunched under Peter's boots as he stumbled back into the warehouse the next evening. Exhaustion and fear churned in his gut, but desperation pushed him forward. He couldn't explain why he returned. Was it the paycheck that felt like a lifeline? Or something else, a darker compulsion he refused to admit to himself? Either way, the warehouse's looming silhouette drew him back like a moth to flame. Maybe it'll be quiet tonight, Peter thought, trying to convince himself, though the memory of the pale boy's eyes still burned at the back of his mind. The air inside was heavy, stale, and cold, as if the building hadn't been touched by time or life in years. Peter's flashlight flickered to life as he stepped inside, its beam cutting weakly through the gloom. The echoes of his own footsteps followed him like unseen pursuers, chasing him deeper into the cavernous dark. He tried to stay in the office, locking the door behind him, but the silence gnawed at him. Every creak of the building felt magnified, every sigh of wind like a whisper threading through the walls. He sat at the desk, hands trembling, staring at the window as though the pale boy might appear again. Then it started. Thud, a muffled sound echoed from somewhere in the warehouse. Peter jolted upright, his pulse quickening. Thud. Thud louder this time. Rhythmic, like heavy boxes being dropped. Or footsteps. Peter grabbed the flashlight, the beam shaking wildly as he turned toward the door. "It's just the building settling," Peter muttered. "It's nothing." The sound came again, closer now. Peter's skin prickled. Something wasn't right. Swallowing hard, he forced himself to move. The door creaked open, and Peter stepped into the warehouse, his breath fogging in the air. The flashlight beam swept over the rows of towering shelves. Nothing moved, but Peter couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet carried him deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, a crash shattered the silence. Peter swung the flashlight toward the sound, its beam catching a crate that had toppled over. Lumber spilled across the concrete floor, but there was no one there. Peter's breathing grew ragged, his throat dry. "Tom," he called weakly, his voice echoing. Silence. Then, from behind him, came the sound of boxes sliding a deliberate scrape across the floor. Peter spun around. The flashlight sputtered, its light faltering as though it were suffocating. In the flickering glow, he saw it. A shelf at the far end of the aisle trembled. The boxes on it began to shift, one by one, sliding off and crashing to the ground. Peter's legs locked, rooted in terror, as the shelf shuddered violently as if invisible hands were shaking it. "Stop it," Peter screamed, backing away. The shelf toppled forward with an ear-splitting crash, narrowly missing him. Dust exploded into the air, choking the light and blotting out Peter's vision. Coughing, he staggered backward, his mind racing. Get out, but the whispers returned. Soft at first, a faint hiss threading through the darkness. Then louder. Closer. Voices surrounded him, overlapping in a language Peter couldn't understand. They seemed to come from every direction, pulling at him like unseen hands. "Who's there?" Peter shouted, spinning around, his flashlight swinging wildly. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He turned sharply, and the flashlight caught a figure darting across the aisle. It moved too fast, too silently. Peter's stomach dropped as he recognized the pale boy, those bruised wrists, that hollow face. "No," Peter whispered, stumbling backward. The shadows shifted around him, elongating and moving unnaturally, like they were alive. The whispers grew deafening now, the air vibrating with their unnatural energy. Peter covered his ears, but the sound seeped into his skull, drilling into his mind. "Stop," Peter screamed. The whisper stopped. Peter froze, his chest heaving. The flashlight beam shivered as he lifted it, and his heart stopped. In front of him, the aisle was filled with figures. Dozens of them. Shadowy shapes stood shoulder to shoulder, their outlines wavering like smoke. Their heads were bowed, their arms limp at their sides, but Peter could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. He backed away slowly, his flashlight trembling as he swept it across the figures. As the light touched them, their heads snapped upward. Their eyes glowed red. Peter screamed. The figures surged forward, gliding across the floor soundlessly. He turned and ran, his boots pounding against the concrete as the whispers roared to life again, louder than ever. The flashlight swung wildly in his hand, the beam casting distorted shadows that danced and writhed around him. He burst into the main hallway, gasping for breath. Behind him, the shadows gathered, moving like a wave. Peter ran toward the office, his vision blurred with panic. He slammed into the door, wrenching it open and collapsing inside. The whispers stopped. The figures didn't follow. Peter lay on the office floor, his body trembling. The flashlight rolled from his hand, its beam pointing toward the window. For a moment, there was silence plus silence. Then, slowly, Peter heard it. Tap. 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 His head turned toward the window. The pale boy stood there, his hollow eyes staring in. His mouth moved soundlessly, but Peter knew the words. Leave. Or stay forever. Peter staggered to his feet, his mind screaming at him to leave. But as he turned, the office door slammed shut on its own, the force rattling the walls. The whispers erupted again, louder, shrieking through the air. Objects flew from the shelves, papers, tools, even the chair, as though the room itself had turned against him. Peter dropped to his knees, covering his head as the chaos consumed him. "Stop it. Please," he cried, his voice breaking. The whisper stopped. Silence. Peter looked up slowly. The office was destroyed, papers scattered like dead leaves, the chair broken in half. The window was empty. The pale boy was gone. Peter staggered to his feet, his breaths ragged. He turned the doorknob, praying it would open. It did. He ran out of the office, through the warehouse, past the shadows that now stood still. When Peter burst through the front doors into the foggy night, he collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The warehouse remained silent, its shadow swallowing the light of Peter's flashlight, now abandoned behind him. From somewhere deep within the darkness, the boy's voice whispered one last time, "Stay forever." Part 8. Vanishing footprints. The sun rose sluggishly that morning, its pale light struggling to cut through the thick fog still blanketing Lot 44. The air was damp, heavy with the weight of something unseen, something unresolved. A single pickup truck pulled into the gravel lot, its tires crunching loudly in the suffocating stillness. Mr. Warren stepped out, his brow furrowed, jaw set. He had expected Peter to call. After all, Peter was supposed to have worked the entire shift last night. The lack of communication wasn't like him. Warren had hired plenty of men in his time, and none were as desperate or as determined as Peter. But as Warren approached the building, unease began to coil in his stomach. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette murky in the fog. And for the first time in years, Warren felt something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge: dread. He pulled the heavy door open, its familiar groan echoing through the cavernous interior. Inside, it was colder than he remembered. The stillness was unnatural, and as Warren stepped in, his boots clicked sharply against the concrete floor. "Peter," he called, his voice bouncing off the walls. It came back to him warped and hollow. Nothing. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting a thin path through the gloom. The warehouse was quiet, but not the kind of quiet Warren was used to. This was suffocating, the kind of quiet that watched and waited. The office door was ajar. Warren frowned as he approached. The small room had always been kept tidy, a place for paperwork and little else. Now, it looked as though a storm had passed through. The chair was overturned, its legs splintered. Papers lay strewn across the floor like discarded leaves, and tools that had been hung neatly on the wall were scattered haphazardly. The flashlight rolled lazily in the corner, its bulb dim and flickering. "What in the?" Warren murmured. He stooped to pick up the flashlight, turning it over in his hands. The casing was dented, as though it had been thrown or dropped in panic. Then he saw them. Footprints. They were faint, a series of smeared marks in the dust on the concrete floor. Warren's eyes narrowed as he traced them with his flashlight. They started just outside the office door, moving erratically into the warehouse. Peter, Warren called again, though his voice was quieter now, tinged with unease. The footprints continued into the aisles. Warren followed them, his boots stirring dust as he walked. The air grew colder the deeper he went, until it felt like the temperature had dropped below freezing. His breath fogged in the dim light. The footprints became stranger the further he went. They zigzagged, stopping and starting in odd places, as though Peter had been running in circles or fleeing from something unseen. Warren's flashlight began to flicker. He smacked it against his palm, his heart beating faster now. Calm down, he thought. There's nothing here. The footprints led him to the center of the warehouse. Warren stopped dead. The trail ended. The footprints simply stopped. No smudges leading away, no signs of turning back. They ended abruptly in the middle of the concrete floor, as if Peter had simply vanished into thin air. "Peter," Warren shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed back at him. He spun in a slow circle, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. There was no sign of anyone, no sound, just the rows of towering shelves and endless darkness. A gust of cold wind swept past him, and Warren shivered violently. It was impossible. There were no open windows, no vents large enough to explain it. The cold seemed to seep from the ground itself, from the walls, from the darkness. Then he noticed something on the floor. Warren bent down slowly, the beam of the flashlight landing on a small dark object. His breath caught. It was Peter's work ID. The laminated card lay half buried in dust, as though it had been dropped in a hurry. Warren picked it up, his fingers numb. The Idaho was smeared with something dark, something that looked suspiciously like blood. Warren's hands began to tremble. He turned back toward the office, moving faster now, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't want to be here anymore. There was something wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. He could feel it. The cold, the silence, the footprints, they all pressed in on him like an invisible weight. As Warren neared the office, his flashlight flickered again. Then, with a sudden pop, it went out completely. Warren froze in the dark. The silence around him was absolute. He fumbled for his phone, his trembling hands struggling to turn on the flashlight. Tap, tap, tap. Warren's blood ran cold. The sound was soft but deliberate footsteps. Peter, he called weakly, though he already knew it wasn't Peter. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Warren spun toward the sound, the faint glow of his phone flashlight finally piercing the dark. He held it up, the beam shaking as it cast shadows against the towering shelves. A figure stood at the far end of the aisle. Small. Still. The pale boy. Warren's breath caught as the boy lifted his head, his hollow eyes glowing faintly red. He raised one bruised hand and pointed directly at Warren. The phone fell from Warren's hand and clattered to the floor, the light spinning wildly. The boy took a single step forward, then another. The shadows seemed to move with him, swallowing everything in their path. Warren stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The boy's expression never changed. His hollow gaze locked onto Warren as he whispered softly, though the words reached Warren like a hiss carried on the wind stay. Forever the cold enveloped Warren. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw was the boy's face empty, endless as the darkness swallowed him whole. The next day, Warren's truck sat abandoned in the lot, its engine cold. Inside the warehouse, the office was empty, save for Warren's flashlight and phone, both dead. And in the dust outside the office door, faint footprints trailed off into the dark, only to stop abruptly, as though the man who made them had simply disappeared. Part 9. The Silent Warehouse. Lot 44 sat in eerie stillness as the fog rolled over its empty gravel lot. The warehouse, an imposing monument to decay, loomed against the muted dawn sky. Its rusting edges and sagging roof seemed to breathe with the damp air, a silent sentinel standing guard over secrets buried in dust and shadows. By mid-morning, the rumors had begun. A local trucker, passing by the desolate road, swore he saw headlights in the fog the night before, a truck idling briefly before its lights flickered out. Another claimed he heard a faint thumping sound coming from the warehouse, like something tapping on glass. It wasn't the first time people had whispered about Lot 44. Stories had circulated for years, whispered in bars and on factory floors. Workers leaving late at night spoke of shadows that moved when no one was there, strange whispers in the aisles, and a bone-chilling cold that settled into the deepest parts of their bodies. Most shrugged it off, but others left without explanation, their nerves frayed and their minds haunted. And now Peter was gone. Mr. Warren's truck remained parked in the lot, untouched, its keys still in the ignition. Those who came looking found nothing but a few scattered footprints in the dust, winding erratically into the warehouse's yawning darkness, only to stop abruptly, as though both men had been plucked from existence. Inside, the warehouse was deathly silent. The air, stagnant and bitterly cold, seemed to swallow all sound. The towering shelves were still, their shadows stretching long across the floor as shafts of pale daylight filtered through grime-caked windows. Nothing moved, and yet the warehouse felt alive, as though it watched, waiting for something, someone. Near the center of the vast space, faint marks still marred the floor, footprints, smaller than Warren's, that circled erratically before disappearing into nothing. A lone flashlight lay discarded nearby, its bulb shattered, its metal casing dented. In the small office, the destruction remained untouched. Papers were scattered across the floor. The chair, still broken, lay overturned. On the windowsill, the faint smudge of a child's handprint lingered, barely visible, but unmistakable. No one who entered the warehouse stayed for long. The silence pressed against them like a weight, growing heavier with every passing second. It wasn't just the cold or the shadows. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at their instincts and whispered in their minds. Leave over the following days, Lot 44 became a curiosity. People whispered about it, but no one dared linger. The warehouse remained locked, its doors chained shut by those who believed distance might keep them safe. But that didn't stop the rumors. The trucker who had passed by swore he returned later and saw a small figure standing in the window, a child, pale and unmoving. Others claimed they heard faint tapping sounds if they ventured too close, like footsteps pacing just beyond the locked doors. A local teenager dared to peek through a broken window one night and ran home pale-faced, muttering about glowing red eyes watching him from the dark. The police came, of course. Peter's family demanded answers. Warren's disappearance raised questions. Officers scoured the warehouse, searching every corner, opening every crate, combing through the dust for clues. They found nothing. And yet, when one officer lingered a little too long near the center of the building, he swore he heard whispering. Low, incomprehensible murmurs that seemed to rise from the concrete itself. He didn't mention it to his colleagues, but when he left that night, he burned his uniform boots, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed him home. Days turned to weeks. The search was called off. The newspapers wrote short, unsatisfying articles about Peter Dawson and Warren Mills, local worker and warehouse owner missing. No leads. A few reporters interviewed people who had worked at Lot 44 in the past, but all they uncovered were fragmented stories, accounts of strange noises, objects moving on their own, and the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. A former janitor named Tom offered the strangest account. The ground remembers, he said cryptically, wringing his hands. You think they moved those graves, but you can't move what's buried underneath. You disturb a place like that, it doesn't forget. People disappear, and the warehouse just waits for the next one. Tom refused to elaborate further. A week later, he left town without a word. Months passed, and Lot 44 became forgotten again. The weeds crept higher in the lot, swallowing the edges of the gravel. The fog still lingered most mornings, clinging to the building like a shroud. The warehouse stood as it always had, silent, unmoving, but waiting. One evening, long after the sun had set and the road leading to Lot 44 was empty, something shifted. The heavy chain locking the warehouse door rattled softly. It wasn't wind. There was no wind that night. Inside, the darkness stirred. The faintest sound echoed through the vast, empty space, a soft tap, 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 like footsteps padding against the concrete. It began near the center of the warehouse, where the footprints had vanished, and spread outward. The tapping moved slowly, steadily, as though searching for something. In the office, the papers rustled faintly, though there was no breeze. The broken chair groaned as though someone had shifted their weight in it. On the window, the faint handprint appeared fresher, the smudge darker and clearer against the glass. And then, in the center of the warehouse, there was a sound. A whisper. It was faint, little more than a breath, but it carried through the cold air like a ripple across water. Stay. Forever. To this day, Lot 44 remains locked and abandoned, but those who pass by say the air around the warehouse feels wrong. Truckers avoid the route, claiming to hear soft tapping sounds on their windows as they drive by. A few locals tell stories of a pale child who appears in the fog, his hollow eyes following anyone foolish enough to stop. And every so often, on a particularly still night, someone swears they see a light flicker inside the warehouse, a single beam, like that of a flashlight, swinging wildly before going dark. No one goes in anymore, but the warehouse waits. It always waits.